is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we're going to be talking about battlefields and maps for your adventure.
So, we promised that we would help you figure out if you are making the number one sort of mistake that can be found in published adventure battlefields. Even professionals have made this mistake. Even professional authors have made the mistake. Professional publishers have published with this mistake, and it's very easy to make this mistake. And as you could see on the thumbnail with me being like, oh no, about this tiny little room.
Yep.
The mistake is making battlefields that are too small to fit all the combatants in it. Now, obviously, that's not the only mistake you can make in battlefields, and there's many ways to make a really interesting battlefield. But that's the number one mistake. And you might even ask yourself, if you've never made this mistake and you're watching this being like, whew, that's not me. Why does this happen? Like, why does it make it into published adventures? And Linda, you have been in charge of like an entire adventure sub-department, and I'm sure you've seen all kinds of reasons for why this happens.
So some of the reasons that this might happen, for example, is that your total map for a region is limited by a certain number of squares and dimensions, and the adventure writer is thinking, oh my gosh, we need to try to pack all of these rooms into a 24 by 30 square map, and we're just not going to have space. Another thing that can happen is when people are taking a look at architectural realism, and they're trying to make rooms that are a reasonable size for their function. And then you wind up with a space that has a lot of tiny rooms for that reason. And then you say, okay, well, I have this map and it has a lot of spaces, and it'd be kind of weird to have this giant map and only to have an encounter in a few of these large rooms, right? So I'm going to put an encounter over here too. But then there's a mismatch between the encounter and the space. And now that doesn't mean that you can't have encounters in small spaces, but it does mean that when you have encounters in small spaces, they should be designed with that small space in mind. So, for example, you're going to know in tighter confines that it may be the case that not all PCs can engage in the encounter at the same time. There might be choke points. Creatures that rely on ranged attacks aren't going to be doing as well. So you're going to need to choose, for those small spaces, creatures that can do well in those small spaces.
And that architectural thing can be really a problem. Because really, realistically, people don't need a 5 foot by 5 foot space around themselves and like a personal space bubble to move through a building. So if you're doing this, like, okay, we're going into the beggar's house map. And it's like, all right, there's a small like toilet room in the beggar's house. And that's where the sewer ooze is going to come out of the toilet and attack the party. And then you're like, okay, but how big does this need to be? You're probably not going to think that the beggar's house has a 30 foot by 30 foot toilet.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of beggar is this?
Yeah.
Like, how many people are handing out? Is it like the beggar begging in front of the king and getting like massive numbers of gold coins in their hand every day to have this 30 by 30 foot toilet? But if you don't do that, and you have this encounter where like this giant enlarged sewer ooze comes out of the toilet and attacks the entire party, there's not going to be, like, any room. Even if it's a 20 foot by 20 foot, which is already way too big for the beggar's house's toilet, that 10 by 10 ooze is going to take up a quarter of all of the space. Maybe there's enough space to move around with the party members in 10 by 10, or 20 by 20. 15 by 15, though, like on the thumb? No way. That can fit 4 PCs and the large ooze with one space left over, and then the PCs are like, all right, guys, is your favorite game those little puzzles where you can slide one square over at a time and then you need to make the right picture? Because that's what we're playing. That's the only space that's open.
Yeah, so in this specific instance where you're like, okay, the building has to be small. What's going on with the encounter? I specifically, in dealing with this one, have generally had the encounter spill out onto the street. So, you know, the PCs are coming along, and then the sewer ooze comes out from the toilet and bursts through the wall, or what have you. So then you have a larger location that you can fight in.
That makes sense.
I see some talking about Hill Country in chat. Hill Country is kind of mimetically the map that we kept using over and over again in organized play scenarios because it was very, very useful and had
it was wide open.
At a wide open space, it had a variety. It had obstacles to block line of sight and to provide cover.
Good
it had
generic terrain.
Good generic terrain, and had a variety of different elevations where you could easily talk about like climbing and things like that. And because it was generic enough that, or it is generic enough that it can fit into a lot of circumstances.
Hill Country for old scenarios.
Yes.
So basically, you're going to run into this in published adventures too, for all the reasons that we've mentioned. Fortunately, and we're going to get into how you can avoid it when you're designing your own dungeons, but when you're bought the published adventure, like that map is in there. Unless you're going to do map surgery, there is one extremely easy hack that you can use to immediately fix this in the published adventure, as long as you're okay with like your city map possibly changing if it's a large building in the city. Turn all the 5-foot squares into 10-foot squares. Now that could mean that this palace that you have, that all the rooms weren't big enough for encounters, is now like 4 times the area, which may have implications for the city it's in. But your group is unlikely to actually go out and check and be like, wait a minute, this is like, now this palace, which was already a large part of the city, is taking up like 30% of the city. They're unlikely to do that. You're probably just going to be okay turning all the squares into 10-foot squares instead of 5-foot squares and calling it a day.
Yeah, and then on your VTT, you can set it up so that you cut the squares in 4s, so it's not like a huge pain on that. You're changing the scale or that kind of thing. And if you're doing it at a printed map, you can print it in. You can print it out larger, and then if there's enough space then there's enough space to put people in kind of the 4 corners of it. If you want to draw little lines, then you can do that. Or if you're drawing it out yourself, you can do it. You
Absolutely.
can do it that way. So yeah.
If you only run published adventures, and the only thing you're here for is how to fix it in the published adventures, that's basically all you need for a quick fix. And especially if it happens at the table and people are like, is there enough space here? You can just be like, all right, guys, I know we did it as 5 before, but pretend all these are 10 from now on, including the rooms you've already been in. That can be done with almost no time. It may take a little bit of time to put the grid on your VTT, depending on your VTT of choice, but it's not too bad. However, there's a lot more to say if you're trying to make your battlefields better than those 15-foot by 15-foot rooms, other than just, do a 30-foot by 30-foot featureless room. If you want to have a cool battlefield, one that goes above the toilet low bar of it's not the beggar's toilet issue, where
encounters tactics and design tactics can actually take place in space of encounter.
Yes, but instead we move up to the higher bar of it's a memorable battlefield that actually makes the encounter interesting and different.
Yeah.
And look, you might be thinking Mark and Linda are going to talk about some kind of super complex thing where you're like in a demi-plane and there's moving platforms that at the end, at a certain initiative on each round, they rotate around like a clock, and because time is going weirdly. And
I have done something pretty similar to that.
Also, other platforms that appear and disappear on alternating even and odd rounds, that it changes between the red and the blue platforms while the other ones are rotating. And it's like, yes, you can have those
I would
sometimes.
recommend using that kind of stuff very sparingly because it is exhausting for you as a GM and for the players to keep track of that. So that's got to be like your big showpiece, like, whoa, encounter for the end of the session.
That's right. But you don't need to go all that far to make an amazing battlefield for your adventure. Sometimes you do. But the GM who is doing that every single encounter, it's probably overdoing it, unless you're playing in a pretty low combat campaign where you and the players have agreed that you're going to have few but extremely set-piece encounters like most of the time.
Jenna says mix it up. Every other round the map is either 5-foot or 10-foot squares. Got it.
Oh man, that's like a spatially contracting dungeon.
Oh my god. It's basically like everyone who's playing Theater of the Mind just give up.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
So, to make an amazing battlefield map that is not like super techy and complicated, Linda, what would you say are hallmarks of like a simple but awesome battlefield?
I would say think about what gets in the way of moving, and think about what gets in the way of attacking. So this might be obstacles that are in the way. This might be, like difficult terrain. This might be like a difference in elevation or a required pathing to get to a certain place that prevents people from. Well, when I say attacking, I guess what prevents people from doing stride up directly up, completely unimpeded, strike until the end of days.
Absolutely. So here's an example of this in a published adventure. There was a room, and it had some hobgoblins. They weren't even that strong of hobgoblins compared to the party, but they were all right. But they had built a wall that literally blocked all the way to the ceiling, the other side of the room, and they had arrow slits in the wall that they could use to make ranged attacks at the PCs. Mm-hmm. And so that was an interesting challenge because it wasn't just fighting those hobgoblins, which they'd fought similar hobgoblins before. They had to deal with the wall. And what they did was Linda's character used stone magic to completely create a hole in this giant wall, and then the rest of the PCs went through.
But then the question was, are we going to bash down the wall? Are we going to magically make a hole in the wall? Are we going to go around the other way? Are we going to seal off the holes?
Options.
We have a lot of choices.
They could have made their own wall that was past that wall, so the arrows couldn't even fit through the wall either, and then done somewhere else. That made it interesting, even though it didn't take much. It was just a wall. It wasn't a super complicated battlefield. It was even basically just a room with a wall in it. It didn't have, like, massive numbers of elevations and, like, lava spitting out of a vent or anything like that.
And even, like, pieces of furniture can make for interesting things sometimes. Like, I had an encounter in an adventure where, there's things about... You can climb, something's up at the top of a shelf. You can clamber up to the top of the shelf where, like, the shelf might fall on you or something like that. Thinking about the ways that the creatures are, like, there's a bubbling flame in the center of the room. There's hazardous terrain or things like that.
Or even literal hazards.
Yeah.
Simple or complex kinds of hazards. Even if you're not playing in a game that has defined simple and complex hazards like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you can still put some kind of, like, a trap-based thing that is doing stuff every round until the PCs find a way to deal with it in just about any game system.
Yeah.
You might have to treat it as, like, a construct creature in some systems that don't have a really easy way to do a complex round-by-round hazard. But
in most cases, PCs are the ones who are on the offensive rather than the defensive. They're the ones who are invading the stronghold of someone else. And the someone else is going to know their area better and had a chance to set things up to their advantage.
Yes. So consider, like Linda said, things that obstruct mobility, things that obstruct attacks, but also things that maybe allow for interesting attacks or tactics. So here's an example. Suppose that the PCs are invading a gremlin, sort of a gremlin-infested area, and they do not have, like, sprites or other tiny PCs. Maybe there are little tunnels in the wall that are tiny. And the gremlins can use those tunnels to go from room to room, or even, like, across a room that has a lot of difficulty to traverse by just going through the tunnels. But the medium PCs have no chance. The small ones might be able to squeeze through slowly. And that is just an interesting option. It's like, oh, is the halfling going to go alone in the tunnel?
Yeah.
You might be able to chase after them when they retreat through the tunnels.
Are they going to get another tunnel and pincer attack you?
Exactly. So at least interesting choices and just interesting... The asymmetric nature of those little tunnels make a fairly simple addition to the battlefield into something that is interesting to think about. That's the key. You're not here to crush and destroy your players' characters as the GM. You're here to make them interested, to make them think and make them feel good about how they found a solution to something that was in their way.
So, and especially if those challenges can be something that's both a challenge when used against the PCs, but also something that the PCs can then themselves use to their advantage. So, maybe their opponents have some really good high ground in a particular encounter, and then after that encounter, they claim the high ground, and then when reinforcements come to try to back up their opponents, now they're the ones who can use that area to their advantage. Or maybe there's something on the map that allows them to attack and use some kind of bespoke action that's like, fire the flame cannon or do some other interesting thing that involves interacting with the map in some way. And I mentioned earlier on about 3D. This comes into play both with like, height and elevation. Are you gonna try to quickly climb, or are you gonna take the long way around? Is someone gonna like cut the rope on a bridge to make it harder for you to cross? But also what Mark was saying for the gremlins, that if there are opponents that have access to non-universal mobility forms, like they're opponents with a climb speed, there might be or a fly speed, there might be like tunnels on the ceiling or on the upper walls that they're going through. If you have a encounter that's underwater, you might have things coming in 3 dimensions as well, like the hole in the ceiling is where someone's going to swim out of.
That's right, and you can have the situation change either for better or for worse for the PCs. It doesn't always have to change to be worse. So with the gremlin example, maybe the group finds mushrooms that Alice in Wonderland style change their size, and they're able to become tiny. That would let them use the tunnels, which suddenly changes the entire layout of the dungeon for them, because now they can use them. And maybe at that point also they've taken care of the gremlins and they found these mushrooms, but now there's like an invasion by some other more dangerous type of creature that are themselves medium. But the PCs are the tiny ones who can use the tunnels to their advantage. And they have to now defend against these other, maybe it's like an evil adventuring party coming after them. Maybe it's just like an invasion of hobgoblins. I don't know. I was talking about a hobgoblin thing before, so I used hobgoblin, bugbears, something else. The point is, they can use the tunnels the same way the gremlins did on them. It can make them feel good because, like Linda said, players and their characters are usually going on the offense. So it can be a change of pace to allow them to be the ones who take the major advantage out of the battlefield position. It doesn't have to be something that's a disadvantage to be interesting, though it is true that the PCs are usually built to be able to clobber their foes if they don't have some kind of challenge or change in the situation. So if you're giving them also on top of that massive advantages due to the battlefield, that means they can use that to face a more interesting or dangerous challenge potentially, rather than unless your goal is just like let off some steam, let them show how strong they are by like it's an easy fight and you had advantages.
Yeah. And in that case, you might want to you could also set up like a challenge, a skill challenge or a hazard or something else that is having to do with dealing with an area in advance to set things up for your opponent's arrival. And, maybe then you set things up so you're going to trigger an avalanche, and then, that defeats half of the enemy force, so that the encounter that you fight is like only a severe encounter as opposed to a force that the players knew was going to be just completely annihilating.
That's right. So when you're looking at a battlefield and you want to take it beyond featureless to make it better, what you're looking for are direct threats, like those hazards and traps, but they might not even be a hazard so much as a direct threat, like hazardous terrain that Linda was mentioning before. You want to look for hindrances that are going to block the PCs from using their favored tactics or whatever their default mode is. Opportunities for the PCs to do something extra special or cool. And some of those will be combined to like a probability that's a potential hindrance that can then become an opportunity if you
or
use
it might
correctly.
Be something that you can turn in, something that you can, an advantage that you can create by doing something clever in this space.
Like a potential advantage. Or something that's potentially one or the other. Like, hey, there's barrels of explosives in this room. Is that a problem? Is that an advantage? Well, that all depends on who sets them off and who's standing nearby. It's at least enough to make people get a little interested, and it raises the stakes a little bit about the room. So think about that. What's dangerous here? What are the opportunities? What's interesting here? What makes it different than every other encounter? Because it's possible to create a room that is not a featureless room, but that ultimately is not different than any other encounter. Like if you have a room and there's lots of chairs on the side of the room, it's a huge 80 by 80 foot room, and there's chairs along the side, and the fight is in the middle of the room. Then
ultimately, that's not different from a room that's slightly smaller. But if it's a, if it's a room that's, has a table in the center of it that creates difficult terrain, or that has something on it that could be used in an interesting fashion, then that makes things more flexible. Or, if, maybe it is a smaller room that has a table and chairs, and people are just going to consider that mostly to be an obstacle to go around, but the PCs are fighting against, like, an improvised weapon fighter who's going to be bashing people over the head with chairs, and the fact that there are chairs there is suddenly interesting.
Yes. Now, there's a question in the chat about how can you creatively use a published flip mat or any other kind of map that you've purchased or found online for your adventures to make them more interesting or dynamic.
So the first thing... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, what's your first thing?
I would say the first thing to keep in mind is that maps rarely draw everything that is supposed to be there. So you can definitely add more details. You can also change what the things that are shown on the map represent, to when you're reusing maps. If you have something where the map shows, there's like a statue here or something, maybe that's actually an animated object in your version of it. Or maybe where the statue mark is, there's instead like a shrine, or there's instead a fountain, or there's some other object that puts that is in that location, and that's a marker for it. And because maps don't always or even often show everything that's going on the floor, you can definitely add additional obstacles in there. I know there's like some pawn sets that are like, hey, here's some objects that you can throw on top of your map. Another thing to consider, and this definitely comes up when you're thinking about how to make a map look interesting when it's drawn, is that maps are 2D top-down projections. They don't show you anything about the walls. So if there's anything interesting on the walls, then the map wouldn't show that anyway, and it's very easy to add that without looking like you're contradicting what's happening.
All right, so I would say the first thing that you think about before any of that is which published flip map you, or which like map that you bought online from any of the cool cartographers that you can support that are making maps, which one do you use for the situation? Ultimately, you want to look for something that already has some kind of interest or dynamism to it and is roughly in the vein of the type of encounter that you want to run, because, as Linda said, you can tweak it. You can reflavor things. It doesn't have to be exactly what's on there. But ultimately, if you bought the Burning Forest and then you want to use it for a glacier ice field that has 3 pyramids on it and stone men here, that might not be the Burning Forest was like the best place to start for that.
Yeah, you'll want it to have representation of what you're looking for in some form or fashion. But I do find that, in that case, restrictions can breed creativity, because let's say that you created a map and you picked a map and you say, okay, well, there's like 5 objects on this map and I want them all to represent something. Okay, what 5 things do I want to put in here?
That's right. So there are people in chat who are asking, what about Theater of the Mind? Does that actually make people more or less likely to engage with interesting battlefield, sort of anything that was in the battlefield that was interesting? Because on the one hand, they can't see it. When you have a picture that literally shows that there's a giant piano on the map, maybe they're more likely to think about using the piano. On the other hand, though, Theater of the Mind can actually make the battlefield more dynamic and interesting. And here's how. It depends on your group entirely. If your group is the type that if they don't see it, they're just not going to think about it at all, then Theater of the Mind is going to hurt your ability to have an engaging battlefield. Even if you're like, guys, I described there were explosive barrels there. Are you sure you're going to run right to that spot and then do an emanation of fire? If you have that group, then you may want to use a representation that's not Theater of the Mind for dynamic battlefields. But if you have a group that is always thinking about things, you might find that your battlefield becomes more dynamic that way with less work from you. Let's take an example. Let's say that you're doing a fight that's in a giant stables with, like, man-eating horses that are kept by the King Diomedes, and you're trying to do this. One of your players is obsessed with horses and is equestrianism or whatever. So they ask about, like, I'm not, so I don't know, but, like, some kind of tools or other things that you would always keep in a stables. And if you had run that map, you wouldn't have put it in there. Or you would have spent hours Googling equestrian stuff in stables to successfully put it in there. And they'd be like, well, I would think that on this side they would have this and that object, right? And then you would be like, you know what? Probably roll a perception check to see if you can find where that is. And then, or maybe instead of a perception check, they roll an appropriate lore or other skill check to find it. And so at that point, what you've got is the ability to make your creative group's ideas incorporated without having to pre-plan and put all of them on the map in advance. So you can see like the sort of the give and take of that, depending on your group.
It also is going to depend upon how difficult it is for your group collectively to keep track of what's going on with the other details when you're doing theater of the mind. Like, our home group definitely, like, kind of works together and thinks about things more in terms of, like, okay, yeah, these, we're about, like, one move away from this combat, and then with one move or two moves, then you can get there.
It doesn't always work.
It doesn't always work. And I find that whenever I'm personally as a GM, I'm dealing with some of these more complex areas, even if I'm running at Theater of the Mind, which I do often run Theater of the Mind, I will have like a very basic sketch that I'm using for myself. So I may not be pulling out a whole map, but I'm doing something to keep basic track of where things are and then to be able to give players reminders of the relative locations of things as needed.
So also think about your group and the game system you're using. Not all groups do well with Pathfinder or D&D or one of those types of games in Theater of the Mind. Now, Delver, who is in the chat right now, played with me running in Theater of the Mind in Pathfinder 2 in a group of YouTubers who, I think about half of them had never even played Pathfinder 2 before. And it went great. But not every group is going to be able to do okay with that. I mean, there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of positioning and measurement in the game, and depending on you as a GM and all of your players who are working around, you figure out, does the game work well overall, and are they creative, or are they more likely to just do their basic thing because they can't picture it in their head without the picture?
And in the same way that the general wisdom of Theater of the Mind is, when in doubt, round in the favor of the PCs, for like how far away things are, or what have you. You can have that still apply whenever you're dealing with like interesting terrains and things like that.
Absolutely. So, as you can see, in order to fix this problem, you can use threats, you can use opportunities, hindrances, or just generally just anything that's interesting and that catches your player's attention. If you use Theater of the Mind especially, but even if you have a map there that shows things, you can allow your creative players to ask you questions about, is this there? Or wouldn't there be more pillars to support this roof if you're one of your players an architect or something like that? You can always change it. Even if you were using a pre-published map or if you drew it and it didn't have the pillars. Or you could come up with an explanation and be like, there aren't, but you know what? Your dwarf has stone cutting. You notice that the stone is sagging because, like you said, there should have been more pillars, and you didn't think of this in advance.
Yeah.
And there should have been a third pillar in there, and you notice a little divot. Maybe there used to be one, and it got removed, and now it's possible that that's going to collapse. If someone put enough force in that space where the roof is sagging, you might be able to collapse the roof because of the lack of the pillar.
And that's another thing about like changing the dynamics of the battlefield and having opportunities to transform the field, whether that's something that the PCs do or, because Kool-Aid Man, the NPC, busts through the door in the middle of combat, or, you have something like the complicated things we were talking about earlier, but in a maybe less ridiculous way, like somebody opens a secret door and comes into the encounter, or like there's an elevator that can be raised up and down to get from a lower section to an upper section. But it's broken, and so you have to like try to fix it if you want to go up to the top.
Absolutely. And like Delver mentioned...
Or it's not broken, and you can sabotage it.
Like Delver mentioned, some players have aphantasia. And if they do, you do not want to be using Theater of the Mind. Check with your group. You can go ahead and flat out ask. You may want to do it one-on-one in case you think that most people might have one opinion, but someone else wouldn't feel comfortable telling you their opinion because they don't want to be the one person who's like cooling your jets on something that you want it to be doing. Sometimes it can be easier. Or even if you think one-on-one is intimidating, you could have an anonymous survey where you just let your players anonymously say what they're okay with, what they're more interested in seeing, and you can figure it out from there. So basically, figure out what works for your group and then do something to catch their interest. And sometimes it doesn't have to be an opportunity to make the fight easier or a problem that makes the fight more difficult. Maybe it can be something else that is just like sounds or looks really cool, hints towards the story, or even moves the plot forward to what's after the fight by like, oh, look, there's some really cool looking stuff here that you might be able to loot. I mean, I guess during the middle of the battle, but you probably have more dangerous things to think about now. But also, you probably don't want to blow that up with your fireballs either.
Yeah.
So you have to be thinking about it somewhat during the fight.
I'm gonna point out one thing that folks sometimes think of as like, this is what I'm gonna do to make my maps more interesting. That can be a double-edged sword, and that is deciding that the problem with battle maps is straight lines. I've definitely seen quite a few situations where people then decide that means I'm going to draw all sorts of wild curves all over the place to make the shape of my map. But whenever you have, first of all, those are harder for people to like draw in the first place. And second of all, whenever you have partial squares, then you can get into things where like players and GMs are uncertain on, is this square in this room or is it not in this room? And that can make things much more complicated.
This is especially bad in published adventures, which is why Linda, being in charge of a sub-department of published adventures, definitely had it to mind. If you're making your own, and you are confident that you are the world expert in whether or not that one weird squiggle you drew was a square or not, and that even 2 weeks, 3 months later, 2 years, I don't know how fast you are doing your dungeon, that you'll remember whether it's a square or not, maybe it's okay for you. And nobody else will ever have to reproduce your map, because once you've drawn it, that's the map. But for a published adventure, it's a big issue if you make a weird, impossible to draw thing as your map, and hard to tell whether it's a square.
Sometimes you're going to have inorganic edges, like a cavern or whatever, but I would recommend make sure that partial squares are either barely there or mostly full as much as you can, because then it's a lot easier for GMs to be like, okay, yeah, there's a tiny bit lopped off the square, but it's fine. Or, oh, this square has a teeny triangle and that's all that's there. Okay, yeah, that's not a place I can stand.
Absolutely. So, I think that with these tips and tricks, that you're going to be able to make your battlefields exciting and engaging and interesting without necessarily being that wild, like moving and disappearing platform map or like an exploding volcano at all the time.
The map is actually shaped like a spider, and each of the spider legs is both curvy and retracts.
Now, sometimes
every other route.
We use it as a funny example, but sometimes that map is awesome.
Yeah.
Use it every once in a while, those super complicated ones. But often in the encounter, try to throw in like a twist. Just one. A simple one. That they can look at, think about how to deal with, and then feel good about overcoming or using to their advantage.
I would also say that even if you're a GM who usually uses theater of the mind, when you move to those very complicated battlefields, it's no shame on anyone to bring out a map. It'll probably make the experience much easier for your players.
That is true. You like with that thing I described where it's moving like a clock in the moving platforms, and then half the blue the blue non-moving platforms disappear every even round, and the red ones disappear every odd round. You kind of, even someone like me who wants to do theater of the mind 90% of the time,
you're gonna want to have like, I have the blue and red platforms out here on the map, and I'm showing where they are, and this is what's going on.
Yes,
absolutely.
So that could be a sometimes snack. Together, that will make your battlefields awesome, and you will have even surpassed some professionally published adventures with those tiny 15 by 15 or sometimes 10 by 10 foot rooms.
So another thing I did want to bring up that I was thinking about here with rooms and things like that is like layer effects that you see in D&D 5e.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that they got rid of it in 2024, but I thought it was a really cool idea that was similar to complex hazards in the sense that it was some other thing that's happening because of the like the layer or the environment around it, but then by giving it a separate name of layer actions, it made people more likely to use them.
Yeah, so I would say that when I saw that being a thing in D&D, I thought, wow, that's a really cool way to think about things, and it can inspire folks to maybe think about that in their other games too, about how does a creature interact with this environment?
I've often listed it when people ask me what are like the top 3 things that are in D&D but not Pathfinder that you would think is just a cool idea or way of doing things. Ironically, they have removed, I suppose, but is that by giving it that name, even though Pathfinder can do the same thing, but it doesn't have the name. And name gives it power, and makes it easier to use it.
Names have power.
And Matt Guy David says there are a few layer effects, but that they're not really like layer actions that are on the monsters anymore. Yeah. Having that name for it is very helpful, and that can be a way to think about it even outside of D&D 5e.
Yeah, and if you're playing in a game system that doesn't normally have a grid and has like, areas and regions, then these battlefields may come into play more in the terms of a list of obstacles in the room, challenges and opportunities and things like that. But you can still come up with these kinds of ideas even if you're not counting out squares.
That's right. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this topic. Please like and subscribe, or even join us for real if you'd like to support us. Before you go, we've got a vote up for our next Tuesday episode.
I'm seeing a vote for Numbat
we have one vote for 3.
Scroll down. I thought I saw one. Yeah, Math
and
Guy
one vote for
1.
1. The votes options.
That Numbat's 3 and Math Guy's 1.
The options are build an item workshop, where we'll just build an item flat out in real time based on your votes here in chat. Ask RK Mark Save My Game Q&A, where you can ask questions to save your game. Our tools for GM and players. What's in a name? About naming in RPGs. RK Mark Plays will play a game. We can figure out what that is later on. Or other, where you specify whatever you want and then see if you could convince enough people to vote for it.
All right, so we got a second 1 in here. So that is 113.
But I see there's more people
1
watching.
3.
Ooh, build an item workshop might win. There we go. Let's see if 3 can do a surge of tyranny to take back control. But if not, then we'll be building an item.
Kojo's proxy vote, wasn't enough to stop tyranny from winning last time.
Oh, so. No, it looks like there's a vote for the name one.
Oh, that's a vote for 3.
That's 2-3. It will only take one more vote to tie it up.
There's a vote for 1
Jusef
again
is
now.
in there.
All right.
Now it's a vote for 1. All right. Looks like we are going to create an... Oh, no,
vote
for
3. Wait,
it's
4
within,
to 3.
It's within 1.
It's within 1. We can't call it yet.
And a lot of people are watching right now.
We can't call it yet.
Relatively for us. So... if there's one more,
let's give people, the watchers, XP.
Oh yeah, let's give everyone XP. Before you go, stick around, get some XP. I'm handing it out.
Channel XP has
Boom,
been distributed.
You got it. Anyone who just left is going to be like, aw, I didn't get the XP. So, there we are. It looks like that's it. So, it is in a nail biter. By 1 vote, it looks like
it looks like the items have it, but name is popular.
Winner.
Name's certainly going to stay on the poll.
We'll keep it in there. Vote for it. Come watch us on Saturday when we are going to do a video that is about keeping it simple. Which we kind of talked about keeping it simple but cool in this Battlefield one. And we're going to talk about keeping it simple as a player, mostly, but like how to simplify the things that you as a player find sort of difficult or complex.
So we'll talk about some of the common
out.
things that people might find complex and ways to simplify those. And anyone who is in the chat and has thoughts about what they might find complicated or what they've seen other players or GMs find complicated during that episode, please feel free to bring those in and we can discuss those as well.
And then
we always welcome feedback and comments from chat.
And then next Tuesday, we're going to build an item. So, all right, everybody, have a great week. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.